Of Economic Affairs, thanks very much for joining us for this latest in our In Conversation series of webinars, where I sit down with a politician, a thinker, an all-round newsmaker, and ask their views of the world around us tomorrow at the moment, and what we should do about it, and what we should be doing tomorrow and the next day to make sure that things get better. And before I introduce our fantastic guest this evening, let me just get all of the boring housekeeping rules out of the way. As per normal for an IEA event, this is being streamed to an audience on Zoom and is also being streamed publicly on YouTube. If you're on the Zoom side of the channel and you want to ask a question, I'll put as many as I can squeeze into our guest this evening, but please don't put them in the chat box, please put them in the Q&A box. I've got an iPad on my lap at the moment, it's only open to the Q&A box. Put your questions in there whenever they pop into your mind. We're going to be covering a vast array of topics, from the future of the union to trade, tax, spending, inflation. So whatever you'd like to ask our guest speaker this evening, just put that into the Q&A box. Which brings me to a very, very warm welcome to the Right Honourable Dr. Liam Fox. Liam, fantastic to have you with us, not just virtually, but in person.
It's amazing, isn't it?
Absolutely incredible, something approaching getting back to normal. Of course, you've been a Conservative Member of Parliament since 1992. You've held numerous senior positions over your long career in Parliament, including Conservative Party Chairman, of course, most famously Secretary of State for Defence and Secretary of State for International Trade. When you were the International Trade Secretary, you were tasked with creating the UK's first independent trade policy for 40 years post-Brexit, and you argued very strongly in favour of global trade liberalisation, championing free trade, and you support a rules-based system with WTO reform. You were, of course, our nominee to be Director General of the WTO, and back in 2013, you published your book, Rising Tides, in which you warned that many of the world's institutions are ill-equipped to tackle the economic and security threats of the 21st century. We, of course, know you as a good friend of freedom and of the Institute of Economic Affairs. So, Liam, thanks very much for joining us, and we've got a huge amount that we need to get through this evening. And I'm going to start with the general state of the economy. Of course, we've had a year or more of lockdown and a big backwards leap for the economy. Hopefully the end's in sight. But what's your audit of the economic health of the United Kingdom at the moment?
That kind of depends on your starting point and over what timescale you're looking at it. Famously, John Major said, he asked the question of Boris Yeltsin, what's the state of Russia today? And he said, good. He said, what's the state of Russia in 2 words? He said, not good. So it really depends. So I think that clearly we've gone through an unprecedented position with COVID. I think to get a real view, you need to go back to pre-COVID and see where the trends were going then. And I think that the QE program had gone on too long. I think that there were potential inflationary risks associated with that. I think that's still the case. Clearly, I think that the furlough scheme did wonders to stopping the economy collapsing, but only 10% of the workforce are now on furlough, which is the lowest that it's been. So there's a gradual uptake. I think that the UK economy will recover quite quickly. I don't think it's surprising that our economy was hit harder than some other economies, given that we're so heavily service orientated. In other words, we're people orientated. And when people can't move, then you're going to get problems with that. I think you get the same effect in reverse on the rebound, that as we start to get things moving, you'll start to see more and more activity. So when theatres open, more restaurants will open and so on. So I think you'll see that. I think that's good, but I think we have to look at the wider picture. As you mentioned, global trade. Global trade was actually shrinking before COVID. So in the last quarter, before the pandemic hit, it was slowing. We have to ask why and put that right. And then we've got some COVID-related issues. So we've got very rapidly rising demand, but we might have supply constraints in the global supply chains as a consequence of the pandemic. So there are a lot of unknowns in the global sense. So will we get debt default, for example, in some of the developing nations as they come out of the pandemic? That's hard to say. That will depend on a lot of what the World Bank and the IMF do. So there are still lots and lots of questions. There are some common threads, I think, in that, and I think that one of them is still what's the threat of inflation? My experience in politics is that one thing you can be pretty sure of is that politicians react to inflation and inflationary pressures too late.
And I want to come on in detail to inflation in just a minute, but you rightly said, okay, you know, a grim year, but you need to look at that in the context of what's preceded it. I'm very fond of quoting Warren Buffett, who said, when the tide goes out, you get to see who's swimming naked. You know, the public finances and growth, economic growth, GDP growth year on year, were in a pretty grim state prior to COVID. Whatever you think of the government's steps to mitigate COVID, the furlough scheme, all of the rest, they were in an appalling state, and that's now just got far worse. I mean, the UK debt, on balance sheet debt for the state, is now larger than the entire GDP of Africa. We are running budget deficits year on year, have been forever and a day. It's not as if over the past 20 years we've been tucking money away in the rainy day fund in case a pandemic came along. We've been running deficits for 20 years now. What has to happen on the spending side of the ledger, or on getting deficits down, indeed eliminating them, perhaps even running a surplus at some point in the future, and getting taxes to go down alongside that? The tax burden on some calculations is over this Parliament going to be a higher proportion of national income than it was under Clem Attlee's socialist government after World War II. Not much to be cheerful about here, is there? Well,
of course, what we called austerity was in fact a fairly modest attempt to gradually rebalance the books. It was successful up to a point, but you know, if you think about sort of our classical approach, it would have been in good times when the economy is growing, you put money aside. We've never really done that in recent times as a country. Debt repayment's not something that we've done in very many months in the time that I've been in Parliament. But I think there's a problem here, because we seem to be constantly giving ourselves this choice. Do we cut spending or do we raise taxes to help balance the books? Far too little attention is paid to how do we earn more money out there in the global economy. We've tended, I think, to internalise that too much. So far too little effort's been given to exporting, which earns money for the country. We've got about 400,000 small companies that we've identified who could be exporting because their peers do, but they don't do it. And that brings in a lot of extra potential money to the country. I think we need to think much more about the regulatory framework. How do we help people to be those who will generate wealth? And I mean, as you know, I think the Tory party should be the party that is the natural home of every white van man and woman in the country, but also every white coat man and woman in the country who's in the tech sector. And that, I think, is a key thing for us to do. I think this debate about growth, well, frankly, any idiot government can take tomorrow's money, spend it today, and call the increased levels of activity growth. I mean, Labour governments have done it since the year dot. The question becomes, how do we get more growth? And the way I would talk about it is wealth creation. And I would say wealth creation only happens when you take someone's unique IP, your idea or my idea, and you turn it into a good or a service that doesn't exist today, or a better good and service than exists today. But you're creating something new, and that's how you add value, and it's how you create wealth in an economy. We need to be looking at what are the rate limiting steps in our economy that might hold that back. And also, how do you bring more foreign direct investment into your economy? We know all the right things to do for that, but whether we continue to do them, and when you, just on that, I mean, just to clarify that point, we know why people put money in the UK, and the UK is the second top recipient of money in the world. Our legal system, the flexibility of our workforce and our labour laws, access to higher education, stability of the regulatory framework, the permissiveness of the tax regime. English language, that's even for those of us who are Scots. And also access to tech. And then you've got IP protection. Now, we know all of those work for us, so therefore it doesn't make sense to interfere with the regulatory framework during a cycle on investment in public infrastructure or raising taxes on business. It's the predictability that brings the money in. So we know all the things that we should be doing. The question is, will we? So a frustration for me and many of us at the IEA has been that I think politicians of all stripes have often treated
economic growth as being sort of God-given, just to sort of be like the weather. You know, we'll either have growth rates of this, that, or the other, and the OBR will tell us which one it's likely to be within 0.1%, rather than having a package of policies that might actually increase growth. Of course, some of it, a good amount of it, is dependent on external events. The pandemic's going to hit growth, whatever the government's policies have been. But if you can get meaningful growth into the economy, a lot of these problems about public finances are substantially mitigated. I wouldn't say they disappear, but if we had long-term growth rates of, say, 3% rather than 1.5%, the work that does over a generation is phenomenal in terms of balancing the books. But we've been at a sluggish 1.5%, even putting COVID aside. Let's sort of just imagine for this thought experiment that COVID and the lockdown had never happened. We would be ticking along at this rather pathetic 1.5% per annum rather than 2.5%, 3%, which I would have thought we should be getting to. What's gone wrong? Why has our trajectory fallen from a sort of 2.5% to 3% to a long-term 1.5%?
Well, you go back to that previous point. Why is it that we've got so many brilliant people in the UK with great ideas who end up going to the United States? Because they can't develop their ideas. We're very, very good at startups. We're great at innovation in the UK. Look what we've done on the vaccines, for example. What we're not very good is scale up. And there is a fundamental problem in our economy about why businesses don't choose to have long-term funding plans and tend to go for bank debt. But I've had this. More than one chancellor, I have to say, I've had this argument with, which is, why is it that what some people call patient capital, I would call smart capital, is willing to take much longer in places like Germany than in the UK? Why is it that small businesses from the UK leak to the US because they're more able to get the funding? We have to look at that. It seems to me that that's a fundamental issue.
But do you think that's a cultural point, or to do just with the size of the economy? Or are you able to point to, I don't know, some punitive taxes or some horrific regulations that are in the way of a small company becoming a medium-sized company, or a medium-sized company becoming a tech giant? Or, I mean, what's the, if there are three things you could do you think it's a change of attitude? Or is it a change of tax and regulation in some way? They've got the right regulatory system in Germany or the States and we haven't here.
I think it's a combination, actually. I think that there's a problem with culture. And it's very tempting in the way that we go about funding our businesses, that you pay off your company debts, you've got enough money to buy a house in the south of Spain and you retire. Whereas if you do look at the experience in places like in other parts of the continental Europe, where businesses tend to be handed down in families, or in the US where they say, I've made $1 million, let's make $1 billion. And you've also got, I think, less of our business funding through equity and more through bank debt. I think that's an issue we also have to think about. But it's a combination of things. And it really pains me when I hear British entrepreneurs off to Silicon Valley to make their fortune there, which will hand tax, incidentally, to the United States and not to the UK.
But it might just be are there simpler, blunter tools as well? I've always been mystified why so many businesses here are debt financed rather than equity financed, and I would love to get to the bottom of it. But whichever way round the business is financed, I mean, don't you want a more benign tax environment for business growth? As I say, the tax take as a proportion of GDP is going to be broadly the equivalent of what it was as a percentage of national income as it was under Clem Attlee. Corporation tax being jacked up. I know there are some write-offs for investment. I'm not saying that these are decisive for all and every investment decision, but all things equal, you put corporation tax up, that's going to weigh against the foreign direct investment you say you want to bring in, no?
Exactly, that's what I think. Of course, we used to argue that cutting corporation tax actually brought in more money.
As did the Prime Minister.
As we seem to have reversed our thought on that. I'm afraid I continue with the previous view on that. And there is, of course, a danger that if you're talking about we are going to raise taxes for business in a certain length of time, that you're handing a competitive edge to other countries. So stability on that is fine. Whether we actually see that corporation tax rise or not, I'm still a little sceptical about, and I think it was a carrot to actually bring spending forward, knowing that businesses were sitting on a big pile of cash in recent years. So it may or may not happen. So, but threatening it may not have turned out to be a a bad thing, but we'll see. But we also have to have a proper conversation with our electorate. You can't continue to have an ever increasing trajectory on spending and expect that to be financed without any rises in taxation. The public need to be told, if you want to get continuing services, you'll end up having to pay for them. And people say, on surveys, that, oh yeah, we really think that taxes should go up. What they mean is other people's taxes should go up and not theirs, because when you actually do raise taxes, our post bags fill up very quickly.
Yeah, no, I'm always very sceptical about somebody's stated preference in an opinion poll and their actual revealed preference. People are free to write cheques to Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs over and above their present tax liability if they wish to. And don't you think we've got a problem here that we are, again, I don't think there's an exact science here, but a large number of economists would say we're at the taxable limit of the economy. If you were to look over our lifetimes, no government seems to be able to squeeze more than, 37, 38, maybe 39% of GDP in taxes out of the private sector. And that puts a fairly hard limit on what you can spend, if that's the maximum. And we've tried everything over the last 40 or 50 years. Top rates of tax of 83%, top rates of tax of 40%. VAT's been all over the place. Corporation tax has gone up and down. So if that is the taxable limit of the economy, what you're bringing in now as a percentage of GDP can't go much higher. We're going to have to make some tough decisions on the spending side of the ledger.
In which case you have to say to the voters that we can't increase our rate of spending faster than the rate of growth of the economy, unless you want to see debt continue to rise. And it's a very difficult thing to explain to voters what debt interest does in your economy. When we were getting up there to, 30 billion more of debt interest, when you explain to voters who want another 2 billion here or 3 billion there, for health or whatever, that actually we're paying tens of billions just for the interest on the debt we've already got. And that's one of the problems that we really will get if we see interest rates rise, because the way that we have funded that debt through the QE system means that we're much more vulnerable now to short-term rises in rates. So back in 2009, only about 44% of our debt would be affected within the spending period by rises in interest rates. That's now 59%. What does that mean? It means absolutely nothing to most people, but what it means is a 1% rise in interest rates would add about 20.1 billion to debt interest payments for nothing else. In other words, a lot of that money that we want to see either in the reductions in government debt outlined by the Chancellor, for example, in the budget, or to see spending in other areas will be gone for nothing if that happens. And I'm not sure that people have quite grasped what that additional vulnerability now is in the economy.
So let me start by asking you for a prediction and then perhaps come on to your prescription. Many analysts see high inflation in the near future, or higher inflation at least, upwards of 4 to 5%. Andy Haldane, the Bank of England's chief economist, has said a surge in inflation is the single biggest threat to our economic recovery. You're of course right that in any normal circumstances, inflation would then lead to the Bank of England putting up interest rates. Haldane voted to cut 50 billion off the 895 billion pounds worth of the UK's QE programme. Is, just as almost as a weather prediction, what's going to happen next, whether we like it or not, do you see inflation coming and in consequence interest rates rising, some might say normalising and getting back to something approaching normal as a consequence? Is that on the horizon in the next 6 months, year, 2 years?
Well, I'm always a bit of a pessimist when it comes to the risks of inflation, but partly that's having lived through periods of high inflation. And a lot of voters today have never lived through. They don't know what it was like to see 24% inflation in the 70s, or what did we get, 15% at one point in the 80s, and the impact that has. And of course, it is a moral evil apart from anything else, because it hits poorest people hardest. Because a bigger proportion of their income will be on basic goods. So we have to try It always surprises me from people who call themselves progressives, although I hate their use of that word, because I think that those of us who believe in free markets and capitalism
tend to be the people who really support
are
progress.
genuinely progressive. Let's leave that little woke argument aside. But I think there is a risk if you look at what's happening. So we've seen retail prices rise, retail sales rise very sharply, house prices rising at the fastest since 2007. You've got in the global economy a potential, I think, problem with rising demand coming out of the pandemic, but restrictions on supply because of disruption of global supply chains. All of those things could be inflationary. If you look at the United States, the Fed rate's 0.25%. The 10-year yield is 1.6. So people in the market think that there's inflation coming.
So let's say that is coming. Some people argue that some sort of dose of inflation wouldn't be a bad thing. I mean, not returning to the ghastly days of the 1970s, but that perhaps getting back to inflation at, 2 or 3% and then interest rates at 5 or 6% for sake of rough rule of thumb wouldn't be a bad thing. I mean, do you see interest rates going up? I wouldn't say it would be wholly harmless, right? I mean, people such as myself who've got a mortgage have got used to the fact that I'm paying virtually no interest on it. That's abnormal there. Other economists would say that incredibly low interest rates are not helping the creative destruction of capitalism. They're keeping sort of zombie companies in business. And although on any given day that might be good to not see a company go bust and the reallocation of capital and labour, over a period of time, that's extremely bad for economic growth. Don't we want to see interest rates go back up to something approaching normal? I mean, at the moment, savers are being penalised, right?
Well, over the longer term, a return to orthodoxy would be welcome. And to see savers rewarded for saving would be a good thing. I think that you have to be very careful at the moment when there's enormous economic fragility coming out of, first of all, the financial crash and then the pandemic within a decade. And, you know, the number of times I've heard this argument, a little bit of inflation will be fine. But, you know, you can't really provide any more of a little bit of inflation than you can find a little bit of several diseases.
Yep.
You know, controlling it is very difficult. And as I said earlier, politicians tend to act too late. We tend to act when inflation's already in the system. And I think there are warning signs already there. I mean, I tend to be with Andy Haldane on this one, that fine, we've got through this. It's now clear our economy is recovering. But let's not undermine that recovery with inflation.
So one of our attendees on the Zoom side says, if Dr. Fox was the Chancellor, what would his biggest priority be? Is it inflation? And if you would want the Chancellor of the Exchequer to act fast rather than the historical evidence that, you know, politicians sort of act once the tiger of inflation has already escaped and then try and catch it by the tail, what steps should the government take to limit this problem happening? What should they do now?
Well, I think we need to be thinking of restricting and winding up the QE programme. I mean, that's what a lot of people are saying. A lot of people, friends that you and I have been saying this for a very long time, that needs to happen. I think now that we are well past the financial crash and the risks to the stability of the system, I think that's where we need to begin. As I said, we've already got this increased vulnerability because of the asset purchase facility, and we need now to, I think, unwind that. It's got us through a difficult position, and I have to say that there are people like myself who were very critical at the beginning and said it would cause inflation, which it hasn't to this point, or at least to the extent that we thought it would, some of us. But I still think now this is, given the effect it's having on the impact that interest rates would have on our debt, we need to now diminish that vulnerability if we can.
Let me come back to the.
And also, I think we do need to look at the other elements, and here's where I think that the system of government itself is a problem. A lot of the areas where we were looking for growth don't lie within the Treasury's remit. They don't lie within those strict economic criteria. How do we use our freedom post-Brexit to create bigger export markets for British businesses that will generate income back to the Treasury? Yeah. How do we look at the regulatory framework in business to make it easier for entrepreneurs? How do we make it easier for that patient capital, for that equity to fund businesses? it's more in the sum of government policy than it is in Treasury policy. And I think the silo mentality that we've got has often undermined our success.
Well, that was exactly the question I wanted to come on to, because there's probably no single regulation that you can point to and say, if we just rescinded that, suddenly, economic growth would be unleashed and, we'd solve everything. You've got, millions of different regulations that restrict business, and any given one is only a tiny tweak. So what you need, surely, is an overarching approach that deals with it in the round. And let me tell you something I've been disappointed by, and you can tell me whether you share my disappointment. Both you and I voted for Brexit in the referendum, and I thought one of the most compelling arguments was that the regulatory framework was not necessarily fit for purpose for the United Kingdom. There are all sorts of parts of it that perhaps even quite a lot of it that the UK didn't want and had been outvoted under qualified majority voting. So we need to rewrite our regulatory rulebook in order to better suit the UK. From my perspective, I hope that would mean fewer regulations, but it could certainly mean better designed regulations as well, even if it wasn't just a question of rescinding them. So we've transposed into English law the entirety of the acquis communautaire, and I don't sense any enthusiasm in government to go through this with a tooth comb and to work out which parts of it we might want to amend, which parts of it we might want to rescind, and which parts of it we might want to keep. It's almost having done Brexit, having seen a lot of leading Brexiteers like yourself argue that the regulatory framework of the EU wasn't fit for purpose. We're now just allowing it to sit there in formaldehyde as part of English law without asking any meaningful questions about it. Why?
Yeah, well, UK law.
UK law, forgive me.
So I think that part of the answer to that is kind of a political culture as well, because I always thought there were two tribes in the Brexit movement. There were those who just didn't want to be in Europe. I'll call them the Little Englanders, if I may.
For sort of cultural reasons.
Yes, and they didn't like the EU because it was too foreign and they wanted just to control things themselves. And for them, the end point of the debate was Brexit itself, just being out. Now, for you and I, who didn't like the EU because it wasn't foreign enough and it limited Britain's horizons. For us, Brexit we always believed would be the beginning of the process.
Yep.
And that's exactly the process. Now, I think that Whitehall is still shaped for the Britain that was inside the European Union. And I think that where I agree with Dominic Cummings, for example, is that we do need a shake-up of Whitehall. If the integrated review, for example, is to be successful, we'll need to align our tax policies, our trade and investment policies, our environmental policies, our development policies. At the moment, I think that they tend to be running in parallel lines rather than converging. But that's partly because of the way that Whitehall is constructed. And that needs to change. And I think that there are quite a lot of discussions going on about how you can actually make that happen. I'm talking about some of those later on this week at the Centre for Policy Studies, if I can mention them here.
You can, of course. They're good friends of ours, just right, competitors, but friendly competitors.
And I think that, but I do think that we do need to see some of that actual reform happening, because we've got, and it's not really their fault, but we've got two generations of bureaucrats in Britain who got used to being in the European Union. They didn't have to think about trade policy because the EU did that. Yeah, and that goes for a whole range of other issues. And there's a cultural shift there is required too. And it's also not just about how many regulations we've got, it's also which ones are damaging. So it's, if you think about it in chemistry, what is the rate limiting step? Not how many steps there are. And it's identifying those. And we do well to survey some of those businesses that say we're going abroad rather than staying in Britain. Ask them why, because we know why money comes to Britain. So what's the other side of that coin? Why is money going out of the country?
And do you think that's a cultural phenomenon, a mindset amongst the British civil service, or a failure of political leadership? I mean, I was rather hoping when we left the European Union, I wasn't going to be entirely reliant on the idiosyncrasies of Sir Humphrey Appleby to deregulate the economy. I was rather hoping that a free market government might instruct Sir Humphrey Appleby to deregulate the economy, rather than there being some culture shift or paradigm shift in the mind of leading civil servants. Politicians have got to do it, right?
They do, and they have to do the reshaping. I spoke at the Institute for Government last year on this and said it would require reshaping of Whitehall to actually be focusing on what will generate wealth for Britain. So I'll give you an example. In trade, where we've been talking about rollover agreements with the EU, which are great, and I think DIT have done a very good job on that. But the real advantage of Brexit was that we were able to be outside the European Union's restrictions on bigger global ambitions. The real benefit to Britain of being outside is to be able to help negotiate multilateral agreements, or if we can't get those, plurilateral agreements or coalitions of the willing. Whether that's in services, for example, which is the big gain to the UK. It's a question of not just our freedoms, but being able to lift our own horizons and accept what we are able to do now, and then make sure we've got the structures in place to do that.
In terms of the climate of opinion, and perhaps this will weigh heavily with politicians, and I guess over a long period of time, weighs heavily with bureaucrats as well. Martin Hewlett asks on the Zoom chat, and he is a businessman and an entrepreneur, how can we encourage entrepreneurs' innovation and growth when the general attitude amongst the public to beneficial tax/regulation for businesses is just to label it as rewarding the rich in modern times? There's sort of anything to reduce corporation tax, perhaps. I mean, arguments about the top rate of income tax seem to have ceased now because it would be rewarding the rich. A better regulatory environment, it's rewarding those who've already got it. Is that a problem in our political discourse at the moment?
Yeah, it is. You're spot on. There was a time when we would have accepted that the majority of the people in this country are in the private sector. The majority of our jobs are created by small businesses. Ultimately, our wealth will be created by small businesses, which is why I think we need to shift this debate away from public sector versus big corporations back onto who are the wealth creators in our country. And they are largely those small businesses. They are the people who are willing to forgo their family holidays to make sure that the company gets going. The government needs to ask, what can we do for them? We need, as a Conservative Party, we need to do the equivalent of what Mrs Thatcher did with council house sales, but do it for small businesses. I wanted, the government to have a small business test for the budget, that any measure that didn't help small businesses shouldn't be there. That's where we need to reorientate, and we need to make this argument. Stop apologising for the private sector. We know who creates the wealth in our country. Celebrate our wealth creators. And I remember, and I don't want to go back to that era too much, but Mrs Thatcher used to celebrate the Richard Bransons and people who were out there blazing a trail in the private sector, creating wealth and creating jobs. We need to get back to that and stop apologising for any of that. Not that I think that's a problem. It's not that there's a problem that we apologise too much for, but we don't, I think, champion it to the extent that we ought to.
I mean, correct me if I'm wrong on this, but my worry about the difference between this government's approach and the approach of the Thatcher government was Mrs Thatcher would talk about liberating businesses, cutting taxes, therefore the entrepreneur can take more risks and all of the rest of it. The government's plan for growth, particularly in the poorer parts of the United Kingdom, seems to be built on some sort of 1960s, 1970s regional development strategy or some industrial strategy. We're going to try and make, well, let's take Hartlepool as an example, a seat in which the Conservative Party scored a spectacular win. Well, congratulations to the Conservative Party for that. But the message appears to be, we'll get taxpayers' money and we'll build a bit of infrastructure there, or we'll spend more money on this. I don't live in Hartlepool. I don't think I've ever been to Hartlepool, but I didn't detect that much of the narrative was, here's how it's going to be easier for you if you're just setting up a new business in Hartlepool. Here is how you'll be able to keep more of your hard-earned money in your back pocket. Not that you necessarily need to be some sort of millionaire or billionaire. You're just running a little family business. Here's how you'll keep more of it. That doesn't appear to be in either the narrative of the government or, from what I can discern, its actual policies either. It's about regional spending too much, isn't it?
I think that there's an argument to try to regenerate some of our great cities by putting in the sort of investment that other parts of the country have had. I think it's beneficial in a number of ways. It also stops the drift to London and the southeast. Take Scotland for an example. 800,000 people born in Scotland now live in another part of the UK, the vast majority in England, for economic reasons. If you take simple things like housing, which is controversial at the moment, if people stayed and we created wealth in a lot of those regional cities, you wouldn't get the pressure that you get on housing. So there are positive elements to it. It's also not just hard infrastructure. You're also talking about access to tech and access to broadband, and not just in the bits where it's profitable to sell it in the middle of the cities. How do you extend that out? So I don't have so much of a problem with clearly defined investment where we are looking for a clear economic return for that. And my problem is spending, which is current spending and recurrent spending. That is the problem. And I think that one of the good things about this year's budget was that Rishi made it very clear that what he was looking for was a shift in spending to investment spending away from current spending. That's much to be welcomed. You also have to remember that the Thatcher government came to power at a very different time, when people did remember the fact that we were spending vast amounts of money on wasteful state-owned industries, and that we'd had massive inflation and massive unemployment. Unemployment trebled in the year before the 79 election. So the political backdrop was different. But you're absolutely right. We were willing to make the case for a capitalist economy. We were willing to make the case for a free market, for competition. Markets are always better than governments, because they're the combined wisdom of millions of people, not a few self-appointed policymakers. Competition is always better than picking winners, because it's how we measure our talents one against the other. I think we've got to get back to some of these basic core principles and argue why they are good.
So there's a couple of questions that have come up that are largely on this point. I say questions. You might, when you've heard them, Liam, decide that they're rhetorical questions. One person asked, do you think that the Conservative Party is sadly reverting to its post-war position of simply seeking to run socialism better than socialists? And another person, in terms of the tide of opinion, can you seriously say that the Conservative Party is one that believes in freedom when it seeks to ban advertising of so-called fatty foods, since Boris was a bit plump, and is giving in to the NFU on maintaining tariffs on agricultural imports? It's difficult to discern much of a thread of free market thinking or individual freedom from these sort of policies.
Well, from the last one, I think we'll soon find out whether we're pro-free trade or not. What I find just the absolute epitome of gall is people who argued that we should stay in the European Union and give totally free access to French and German and other continental farmers, but are throwing up their arms in horror that the Australians should send anything to us tariff-free. If anything, it's a very small C Conservative agreement that phases these things out over quite a long period of time. No one seems to remember consumers in this. It seems to be an utterly producer-driven debate. I'd love to see more people in Britain be able to buy quality foods at a lower price. And I'd also love to see the UK agricultural sector embrace exports. There are a lot of countries in the world, particularly in South Asia, and China, India, but others, who are dying to be able to get more protein fed to them. And we could be increasing our export markets. Again, it's part of that broader argument. The banning of advertising, I've never been very keen on. I'm very keen on labelling. I'm very keen on labelling and educating and allowing people to make a choice for themselves. I mean, I know that if I drink a certain amount of scotch, that's probably going to be bad for me, but I want to be able to make that choice for myself. And I think educating consumers is a much better way than banning things. I generally find banning as a Conservative something I'd like to stay away from whenever I possibly can.
Well, hear to that. I think there's too much in the world which is either becoming mandatory or prohibited, and not enough of a range of discretion. I mean, you mentioned on the trade side and the benefit to consumers. Okay, you have to go back a very long while, way before the Thatcher era. I'm thinking back to 1906, when the Conservative Party was protectionist and the Liberal Party was a free trade party. And the Liberal Party's prospectus was actually based on appealing to the consumer, that this is why bread will be cheaper. You know, the Conservatives are in the pockets of the agricultural landlords who are running this protectionist racket, meaning you get a smaller loaf of bread for twice the price. Do you think, especially with your experience, and I want to come on to global trade in just a moment, with your experience as having been our trade secretary, that we've got to make the argument the consumer way round. I appreciate that those benefits are dispersed and are not as enormous as the benefits might be if a producer is forced to close down, but they are huge and real. And sometimes we talk a lot about exporters and hurrah for them, but you know how free trade will make it easier for our farmers to sell their beef here, or our ceramics industry and the potteries to sell their ceramics there, and hurrah for that. But a huge benefit is that what's on the supermarket shelves should be cheaper and better quality, and that probably isn't articulated enough, is it?
Yeah, and I think there are two ways really that you can do that. One is to say to people, just look around your household goods, look at that TV that you've got, and think how that's come down in price over the years. Look at your mobile phone, the increased complexity of that, which has increased nothing like the price compared to what we used to have. You look at the telecoms you've got in your house and think back to the nationalised British Telecom.
6 months to get a line put in.
Exactly. If you had, if you remember, party line in those days meant something very different from what some of your viewers will be thinking of they are now. But so we should be making this case that we've been able to give people a much better and wider choice of goods at lower cost and higher quality than we otherwise. So I was trying to get the British Retail Consortium to get us to do a video inside a supermarket and say, this is what happens if we can't trade freely with X, Y, Z, and watch things come off the shelves and see what you'd be left with. But we need to put more effort into telling consumers how much they've benefited from free trade, because producers who feel threatened will spend a lot of time and money getting their message out.
But that's precisely because the potential losses are concentrated and the gains are dispersed. This is a problem with so much of our side of the ideological ledger, isn't it? You know, putting up public sector pay by a particular amount for a few thousand workers here, they'll take to the streets about it if you don't do it. Whereas the 0.1% you're saving in tax is real for everybody else, but not enough to get people worked up necessarily.
Yeah, and it's partly you sort of referred to it as. I mean, I always regarded myself as a free market liberal when it came to economics. It just so happens that in recent years that's been closest to the Conservative Party, but it wasn't always the case.
It wasn't always the case. It wasn't always the case. I want to talk a bit about trade, because you mentioned at the start of our conversation, Liam, that you know global trade had been declining a bit, perhaps just before COVID. Basically, if I've got my numbers right, broadly speaking, you see it growing and growing and growing and growing over decades. Then from the financial crash, more or less, it sort of flatlines. It might have gone down a little bit or up a whisker, but the trajectory just flattens out. What's gone wrong there again? I mean, you'd obviously expect trade to have collapsed over the last 12 months, but over the past 10 or 12 years, why hasn't global trade been part of the engine for growth and wealth creation that it apparently had been in the 10 or 15 years prior to that?
Yeah, there are a number of reasons. Some of them are cyclical, 10 years out from the crash that you would expect to see in the global economy. The one that always bothered me the most, and the one that I argued against, was this slow increase in protectionism. Back in 2009, only 0.7% of the imports of the G20 countries were covered by any sort of restrictive measure, tariffs or non-tariff barriers. By the first quarter of 2020, that had risen to 10.3%. A massive increase in protection, not in tariffs, but in non-tariff barriers, mostly regulatory. So a bit of environmental legislation here, a bit of consumer protection there. They all added up. And what they effectively meant was, because the G20 are responsible for 90% of global GDP and 85% of global trade, something like that. It meant that huge barriers were being put in place to a lot of developing countries because they couldn't sell into our markets. And you had this bizarre position where we were increasing our aid to these countries, but building a wall when they wanted to sell their products to us. And that's got to change. And that was a crisis that was beginning. It had plateaued, but it actually contracted before COVID.
Even before the lockdown.
Before COVID, global trade had contracted for the first time. And it was in the last quarter of 2019, so just before the pandemic hit. And of course, we didn't know that at the time. But for me, and for others who took a much more free market view, this was an inevitable consequence of the economic and trade policies of the biggest economies.
And how do we unravel that? David Landsman asks a question. As an experienced politician, how do you sell free trade to an electorate when the government's promised to put a protective arm around them? If this works for COVID, why not against other threats like competition? What needs to happen to get us back on that trajectory of seeing global trade rising and rising as a proportion of global GDP?
Yeah, we've got to stop seeing ourselves as a victim of global trade and start to see the opportunities. We are a successful exporting country. We could be much more successful if we got liberalisation in services. What developing countries need in terms of financial services, insurance, legal services, life sciences, if you like, our shelves are stocked high with all those products. Liberalisation of services in the way that we got liberalisation of goods after the Uruguay round and the creation of WTO would do wonders for Britain. But we've got to change our mindset. We've got to see ourselves not threatened by every bit of liberalisation, but saying, hey, that's great. That's another market for UK goods and services. It is a shift in how we see the world around us.
And where do you think that leadership needs to come from? I mean, the IEA does what we can with our limited resources to put the case for kind of unalloyed free market capitalism. We're paid to think the unthinkable as a think tank. You politicians are employed to do the art of the possible, right? I mean, there is an overlap in the Venn diagram sometimes.
Should be.
There should be. I hope there is. But do you think this just requires, I mean, let's say amongst your Conservative colleagues, I mean, does there need to be a rediscovery of a bit of backbone here? I've got sick and tired, you're an exception, of course, but of hearing Conservative politicians begin a speech by saying, we need to make the case again for free market capitalism. It's time to restate the case for free market capitalism. Then they don't actually state the case at all. It's left hanging there. And they move on to, and now I've got a whole load of state spending programs to tell you about. Well, do you think that flame is still flickering in your own party to actually make the case for free market capitalism? And in that case, if that flame is flickering, how do we actually get that case to be articulated more commonly by politicians?
Well, first of all, I think it depends on your worldview. So as I said, there are, inside the Conservative Party, you've still got some, even in the Leave campaign, who what they meant was to be left alone. And then you've got those of us who actually always have believed that there's much greater potential for the UK as an exporting market. There are practical things we can do about it. We can be trying to manoeuvre our outward direct investment, which is there, into places that will create and shape new markets for the UK. So if you are, for example, in helping developing countries to buy those services that they need to improve their capability, you are reducing the need for the overseas aid that we give them, but at the same time increasing the opportunities for UK countries. Yep. It goes back to this point, I think, about getting away from the silo thinking and joining up the various aspirations that we have in policy, but it also requires us to actually believe that Britain could do spectacularly well from a more open global economy, and then find the ways to achieve it. One of the things that we can do post-Brexit is to be there at the WTO arguing for liberalisation in services or tech industries and so on. So we can do it. We just need more people to be making the case.
I want to come on and wrap up with three really big challenges.
Because they've not been very big so far.
These are easy ones. I expected you to easily knock those off in the first 45 minutes or so. I mean, the one is Patrick McIntosh actually refers to this in the chat. We've touched on, if you like, the spot price of inflation and present government spending and how much money we've printed and the high tax rate. But over the longer term, and given it's going to take a long term to resolve this, Patrick McIntosh asks, the elephant in the room is demographics. How do we pay for debt and any welfare promised with shrinking populations, falling birth rates, and probably China and let alone seeing that everywhere else, China, America and the EU and the UK. Do you think the long-term economic future of the UK, for all you've said about, well, let's rediscover innovation and global Britain and the rest of it, the demographics are pretty badly against us, aren't they?
Well, they're not so bad in Britain as they are in a lot of the markets in Europe. But the question is, can we find ways to generate more income as a country? If you don't generate more income, you'll be stuck in this predicament of do we increasingly tax the working population until they're unwilling to work, or do we cut back on our spending? So there are gains to be made in productivity in the UK, for sure. There are gains that technology will bring us, but we also have to find ways of earning more money as a country. And that means selling more into a global economy that has expanded enormously in recent times. And if you look at middle-class consumers across the developing world, you look at Chinese consumers, they are willing to pay more money to get a British product because they believe that having that Union Jack on it is a sign of quality. And again, it comes back to the confidence to be willing to take that leap. And there's also a question about the role of government in whether government should be helping, and if so, how much and in what way UK companies that want to do that. But there's a very big market out there to sell the things we already produce.
And a richer and growing market all around. Yeah.
You look at in Africa, the number of predicted middle-class consumers by 2050, 2060 in Africa. You think that the world's most sophisticated service market couldn't be making a killing selling into those markets? Of course we could.
Well, let's take another big challenge then. I don't want to get into the science of it. I'm more interested in the economics of it. The climate change policies that the government's putting in place. So to get to net zero, whether you think that's wise or not, let's assume for the sake of argument that decarbonisation is wise or is at least going to happen. Now, I don't want to steal any thunder from your upcoming appearance at our good friends at the Centre for Policy Studies around the corner, because I know that you're addressing them later this month on how to approach the carbon problem. But this is colossally expensive, right? I mean, obviously, if it saves the human race and the planet, well, any price needs to be paid. But we've got to factor this into our economic equations. This is going to be monumentally expensive to get anywhere near to carbon net zero. And it's probably easier to do the first 10, 20 or 30% than it is to do the last 10, 20 or 30%. Again, the government's present approach seems to be to mandate certain activities and to prohibit others, rather than using, I don't know, the price mechanism or having a carbon tax or some such like. What would be your approach? Let's assume that this is an existential problem for the planet. What's the broad strategy to try and get things working and making sure that humanity survives the next 30,
number one is global problems require global solutions. So if you look at carbon production, the UK produces 1.01% of global CO2. And we've been the single biggest reduction by any one country since 2009. Huge reduction by the UK. As you say, getting those next reductions will become more and more expensive. Now, you might think that that's worth that expense in terms of the global gain, except that if you've got Chinese or other countries still using coal-fired power stations to make goods that can undercut us, what you will get is offshoring of UK manufacturing capability. It's not good for jobs, it's not good for tax, it's also not good for the environment. And so I think that there has to be some sort of balancing mechanism. My preference is for a carbon border tax that simply says, we charge carbon at this price in this country. However much you use to produce your goods, we will apply a border tax that will give you an equivalent cost. Otherwise, you will get us wearing hair shirts while some of the Chinese are driving in Rolls Royces. That is not reasonable. And while I think that there is public support to deal with the climate change issues, there will be a resentment if we are asked to carry too big a cost while others are asked to carry no cost.
But and underlying what you're prescribing there is, what you're suggesting there, is actual use of the price mechanism, right? Rather than us stipulating, I don't know, diesel cars are going to be banned on this particular date, or solar panels are going to become mandatory on that particular date. You try and find a price, as economists would say, internalise the externality of carbon. You apply the price and then you let the market find the solutions rather than the bureaucrats find it.
Well, imagine thinking that the market might have some of the solutions into that. And I think it is a perfectly reasonable thing. It's one of those odd policies. I think it actually will get support from big business, mainly, and the environmental lobby at the same time. We'll see on Thursday, but it's got a lot of problems attached to it, complications that come with it, some of which I'll try and set out. But we ought to be leading in this debate.
And I want to end by asking you about the future of the union. So we've seen in the recent round of elections the Scottish National Party doing very well north of the border. Themselves combined with the Green Party representation means there is a nationalist majority in Holyrood, or at least appears on the face of it to be a majority to call a second referendum. The Westminster government is setting its face against that. What do you think is going to happen here? And let me just start asking you by the equity of the process. If Scotland wants a second referendum, why can't they have one? I mean, if the Liberal Democrats and Change UK, who had won the December 2019 general election rather than the Conservative and Unionist Party, there presumably would have been a second referendum on EU membership. Why should Scotland be treated any differently if they choose in their wisdom to vote for a pro-second referendum coalition or party? Bring it on, no?
Well, we're in the Union. Scots voted to be in the Union. And the agreement at that time was this was a once in a generation referendum. And a generation is not 7 years. And you don't keep coming back to the same question if you don't like the answer. And so that constitutional power rests with Westminster. And in this country, we go by what the law says, not by what any short-term political outcome is. There's no plan to change that law at Westminster, so it remains on the statute book. There may come a time where the opinion is that there needs to be another Scottish referendum. It's certainly not now during the time of recovery of COVID. And I think even the SNP post-Scottish elections now recognise that there shouldn't be one in the first half of the Scottish Parliament, which puts it off at least till summer 2023. But there are other big issues in all of that. And I think that we need to change our mindset, because this idea that you say to people in Scotland, you couldn't be independent, you wouldn't be strong enough, you wouldn't be big enough and so on, was exactly the sort of argument that got people like us up in arms in Brexit. And the argument has to be, yes, of course, you could be independent, smaller countries have done it. The question is that wise? Is it good for the next generation? Will it give them the economic opportunities that they want, or will you find yourselves on the wrong side of a market across border across the UK? So there are lots of issues in that, and one of the mistakes we've made is that in Scotland, if you look at who is responsible for giving you the success of the vaccine programme, 70% say the Scottish Government. Why? Because we had a choice at the very beginning of the pandemic. We could either manage it using health legislation, which was devolved, or we could use civil contingency legislation, which was Westminster-based. We went down the route of health legislation. I think in retrospect that was a big mistake, because it was great. In England, Boris got the credit, quite rightly, for the success of the vaccine programme, but in Scotland and Wales it was the devolved governments that got the credit.
You think they got the credit for what was essentially a UK government approach and success?
Not essentially, absolutely.
Completely,
a UK
yes.
government. And if it hadn't been for the UK government having the foresight to buy vaccines early as we did, they wouldn't have been available. So in a sense, it was a bit of an own goal, because we had a fantastically successful policy and then allowed the nationalists to sell it as their own, rather than the UK government getting the benefit from that.
The second generation, until you decide again thing, did have a sort of asterisk next to it. And the asterisk next to it was unless there is a radical change in our constitutional circumstances. Well, of course, since the last Scottish referendum, and Scotland voted very heavily to remain in the European Union, the UK as a whole has voted to leave the European Union. That doesn't persuade you that's a significant enough constitutional change to revisit the Scottish question? The presumptions that they were operating under when they voted in 2014 were to take a hypothetical voter. If your overarching concern was that you wanted Scotland to be in the European Union, you had to vote for Scotland to remain in the United Kingdom. Now the opposite applies. I mean, there's no guarantee at all that an independent Scotland would be able to become a member of the European Union, but it would be your only chance, if you want Scotland to be in the European Union, to vote to leave. So if that backdrop has changed so enormously because of the big constitutional upheaval of Brexit, doesn't that short-circuit the once-in-a-generation argument?
Well, I'm not an absolutist, and I think politicians who say never have never opened a history book. And there may come a time when we would want to look at that, but we've just had Brexit. We need to see how that settles down over time. We're just coming out of the COVID pandemic. To spend a large amount of money on a referendum that actually voters in Scotland don't really want. Even voters who voted for the SNP in the Scottish election say, yes, we don't want a referendum now. So there may come a point when there's an overwhelming demand to have another referendum, and any UK government would be foolish not to take that into account. Also, I think counterproductive were they to do so. But I don't think the time is now.
Let me finish with a question on the Union from Jordan Grover, who asks in the chat, would England really be worse off if Scotland became independent? Do you think now the case for the Union, which we've always focused on either being a question for Northern Ireland or for Scotland, do you think this is becoming an English question as well now? That perhaps English voters are thinking, well, if they want to go, better get it over with. And by the way, isn't England subsidising all of these other countries? And we don't precious little thanks we appear to get for it, you might say, as a little England, or indeed merely as a numerate Englander, you might reach this conclusion. Do you think the Union's under strain in England as well as
until you look at issues like defence, where geographically do you recite a nuclear deterrent? How do you protect English airspace as part of our NATO obligations if you don't have the Scottish landmass to base your aircraft? It's not an argument that was often discussed. I think it was hugely under-discussed in the referendum. But all those in Scotland who profess to be utterly pro-European might want to ask our NATO allies what they think about a Scotland that was outside NATO might mean for their collective defence, and see who's smiling in the Kremlin.
And so let me finish by asking you this then, Liam, are you pretty optimistic about the next, let's say, medium-term horizon, 5 years ahead? Obviously, we've had the grimness of the COVID pandemic. Obviously, we've touched on a whole range of threats, problems, opportunities as well. Do you see the UK in 5 years' time having grasped the opportunities and tackled the difficulties, or ignored the opportunities and probably ignored the difficulties as well, and things just getting worse?
So when people ask me this question, Liam, are you a glass half full man or a glass half empty man? I'll just say that I'm Scottish and the glass is not big enough.
Well, that's a very, very good way of looking at it. The Right Honourable Dr. Liam Fox, it's been an absolute pleasure having you with us. Thanks so much. It's fantastic to eventually be able to hold an interview that was in person as well as being streamed as well. Liam, thank you so much. We've covered in a mere hour. We've solved global free trade, capitalism, inflation, state spending, tax, climate change, and the rest of it. So my sincere thanks to Liam Fox. Thanks to all of you for watching. If you're watching us on the YouTube side and you're not yet a subscriber to the IEA London YouTube channel, please hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. If you've enjoyed the video, please give it the thumbs up as well. Click the like button. Also, to remind you, there's an opportunity through Patreon to become an IEA online patron. If you head over to patreon.com/IEA London, and we'll make sure that the link is in the chat below, then you can get priority access to all of our online content, as well as help us keep the studio and the broadcasting going. And my final advert is our Think conference. Our annual Think conference is coming up on June the 12th. It's a virtual conference this year. It is free to attend. We have a range of great speakers, including Bill Easterly and Tim Harford and many, many others. If you want to find out more information for that and register for free, please go to www.thinkiea.com. Thanks for joining us. Stay safe, stay free. Have a good evening. Over and out.